The signal was already dying when Commander Yale Marin caught it. Not dying the way signals die in the deep lanes, attenuated, red-shifted, blurred by distance into meaningless noise. This one was being killed. Something on the far end was shredding the transmission even as the source fought to hold it together. Yale heard the desperation in the pattern before the translation software rendered a single syllable. Short bursts, irregular spacing. The kind of rhythm a creature uses when it knows this is the last attempt. She pulled the frequency hard left on her console, isolating it from the ambient chatter of the 8th Corridor relay station. Around her, the bridge of the ISV Blackmoor settled into the familiar quiet of a crew that recognized something had changed. Lieutenant Pavic at sensors, Okonkwo at navigation, Drysdale at comms, already tracing the origin point with both hands moving across the glass. "Talk to me," Yale said. "Modulated photonic burst," Drysdale said. "Not radio, not subspace. It's light encoded. Someone's using their own bioluminescence as the carrier wave." That narrowed the species list to one. The Cetheron. Yale had never met one. Most humans hadn't. The Cetheron occupied a stretch of deep space so far from the main transit corridors that their existence was closer to rumor than record in most navigation databases. They were a photosynthetic species, tall, translucent, their skin layered with bioluminescent cells that served as both communication organ and emotional display. They didn't speak. They pulsed. Entire conversations conducted in shifting wavelengths of color that human eyes could see, but human throats could never reproduce. When the Galactic Registry had been updated 9 years ago, the Cetheron had declined membership in the broader community. Not refused, declined. Politely, quietly. The way a species declines when it has been ignored by every other civilization for so long that it no longer expects anything from anyone. Now one of them was screaming in light, and the light was being eaten. "Source coordinates," Yale said. Pavic's voice came back tight. "Deep Yaren Basin, 72 light towers past the Keth boundary." The Keth boundary. The unofficial line past which no Galactic Council patrol operated, no treaty was enforced, no emergency response corridor existed. Everything beyond it was listed in the navigation charts as unmonitored sovereign space, which was the Council's way of saying, "You are on your own." Any Council assets in range? "I checked," Pavic said. "There's a hegemony monitoring buoy at the boundary edge. It received the signal 4 hours ago. It forwarded it to the Keth Sector Relay Hub." He paused. The Relay Hub flagged it as a non-priority indigenous event and archived it. Archived it. A species was dying in the dark, and the system designed to notice had filed the scream under local matter. "What about the Concord, the Meridian Assembly, anyone?" Drysdale shook her head. The Concord pulled its deep-range listening posts out of Yaren Basin 8 years ago. Budget realignment. The Assembly never had coverage there in the first place. The hegemony has that one buoy. That's it. Nobody's listening, Commander. Nobody except the ISV Blackmoor, a medium-tonnage survey vessel with a crew of 41, running a routine cartographic update of the 8th Corridor. They weren't a warship. They weren't a rescue vessel. They carried 2 shuttles, a medical bay designed for 12 patients, and enough ordnance to discourage a pirate skiff. Their mission profile was mapping. Their combat rating was avoid. Yale stared at the signal trace on her screen. The bursts were getting shorter, the intervals longer. Whatever was happening at the source, it was getting worse with every passing minute. "Drysdale, can you decode the content?" "Partially." The photonic encoding is dense. They're layering color frequencies in ways our systems aren't built to parse. But the base pattern is clear. She looked up. It's a distress call. Standard structure location, number of survivors, nature of threat. She hesitated. "Commander, the threat signature matches a cascade radiation event. Their habitat is experiencing progressive containment failure. They're venting atmosphere through microfractures and losing thermal regulation." How many survivors? The signal encodes a count, 412. 412 bioluminescent beings on a station that was tearing itself apart. 72 light hours past the point where anyone with authority had decided they didn't matter enough to watch. Yale turned to Okonkwo. How fast can we get there? Okonkwo ran the numbers without being asked twice. At maximum sustained drive, 41 hours. That puts us past the Keth boundary in 6. No relay contact after that. No backup. No extraction corridor if something goes wrong. We'll be operating completely blind. What's the station's estimated time to total failure? Pavic pulled the signal apart, running the degradation curves through 3 different models. Based on the rate of decay in the carrier wave, I'd estimate 50 to 55 hours from the initial broadcast. That was 4 hours ago. Call it 46 to 51 hours remaining. 41 hours of transit. 46 hours of station life at the optimistic end. That left them 5 hours of margin. 5 hours to reach a dying station, board it, extract 412 beings they'd never communicated with, and get them somewhere safe with no support, no backup, and no one even knowing they'd gone. Yale looked at her bridge crew. Every one of them understood the math. Every one of them understood what she hadn't said yet, that the Blackmoor was not built for this, that the regulations didn't require them to cross the boundary, that no review board in the fleet would fault them for logging the signal, forwarding it to Sector Command, and continuing their survey. Drysdale, send a burst to Sector Command. Full signal capture, full spectral analysis, source coordinates, market priority 1. Then shut down the uplink. Shut it down. We won't have relay coverage past the boundary anyway. No point burning power on a connection that won't carry. Log everything local from here on. She stood. Okonkwo, set course for the source coordinates. Maximum sustained. Pavic, I want a full analysis of that station's architecture by hour 12. Pull every Cetheron reference in our database, every merchant report, every academic paper. Model the radiation cascade and find me a way inside that doesn't kill us. Commander, Okonkwo said quietly, once we cross the boundary, Sector Command won't know where we are. If we need help, then we won't get it. That's the math. Her voice was calm, not hard, calm. The math also says 412 people are dying in the dark because every system that was supposed to care about them decided not to. I'm not adding us to that list. She looked at each of them. Anyone who wants to log an objection, it goes in the record clean. Nobody spoke, not because they were afraid to, because they'd already decided. The Blackmoor turned off the mapped lane and drove into the empty. The first 6 hours passed in the controlled urgency of a ship making itself ready for something it was never designed to do. Yale authorized the release of the emergency stores, the supplies locked behind red-striped panels that were only opened when the situation had moved past manageable. Extra atmospheric filters, the backup medical module. Deep space survival rations that tasted like pressed cardboard and contained enough calories to keep a body functioning under duress. They'd need all of it. At the Keth boundary, 6 hours in, the relay signal died. One moment Drysdale had a link to the 8th Corridor comm network, thin, degraded but present. The next, nothing. Static. The Blackmoor had crossed the line and the line had closed behind them like water closing over a stone. Drysdale logged the disconnect. Relay contact lost at 3:47 UTC. Last confirmed position report received by Sector Command. Keth boundary approach 8th Corridor. All subsequent operations unmonitored. She looked at Yale. We're dark, Commander. Log it, keep listening. If the Cetheron signal changes, I want to know immediately. The signal did change. Over the next 12 hours it weakened steadily. The bursts grew shorter, the intervals longer, the photonic amplitude dimmer. At hour 14, the transmission stuttered, dropped out for 8 seconds, came back at half the previous strength, dropped again, came back. Drysdale tracked it with the focus of someone watching a pulse monitor. "They're losing power to their transmission array," she said. "The radiation cascade is damaging the signaling infrastructure. They're fighting to keep the channel open, but the hardware is failing." At hour 18, the signal went dark for 41 minutes. When it returned, it was barely detectable, a ghost of the original transmission, flickering at the edge of the Blackmoor sensor range. Yale sat on the bridge through every minute of the blackout, watching the empty trace on Drysdale's screen, and she thought, they stopped because the equipment failed. And someone on that station rebuilt it, or found a workaround, or held a damaged component in place with their bare hands, and got the signal back, because they still believed someone might be listening. And someone was. For 16 hours, Yale didn't sleep. She sat in the auxiliary planning room behind the bridge with Pavic, Chief Engineer Rosado, and Dr. Tehrani, building the operation from the wreckage of insufficient information. The room smelled like recycled air and cold coffee, and the surface display was covered in overlapping projections that contradicted each other every time someone updated an assumption. The Cetheron database was thin, a handful of academic papers on their biology, mostly speculative, a trade delegation report from a Meridian merchant named Voss who'd visited one of their outer stations 20 years ago and written 12 pages about it, half complaints about docking procedures. 3 images blurred, taken at distance through a shuttle viewport showing structures that looked like vast translucent orbs suspended in scaffold frameworks, their surfaces glowing with the soft internal light of the inhabitants. "The station design is modular," Pavic said, projecting a speculative model based on the merchant's notes and the signal data. "Central habitat sphere, that's where the population lives. Radiating support spars connecting to power generation modules, atmospheric processors, and thermal regulators. 4 spars, 4 modules. The radiation cascade is originating from a failure in one of the power modules. It's bleeding high-energy particles through the connecting spar into the central sphere. Can we shut it down remotely?" "No, the Cetheron don't use radio frequency control systems. Everything is light-encoded. Their technology runs on the same bioluminescent principles as their communication. We'd need to physically access the power module and perform a manual isolation using a light language we can't speak. Through a radiation field. Through a radiation field." Yale pulled up the merchant's structural notes, the support spars pressurized. "Partially, Voss describes them as semi-sealed transit corridors, atmosphere-compatible but thin, roughly 60% standard pressure. The corridors are wide enough for human-suited passage, but tight, no room for heavy equipment." Rosado leaned forward, his broad hands flat on the display surface. "Commander, I can rig portable shielding for a team. Nothing fancy, lead composite blankets fabricated from cargo container lining, draped over suit frames and clipped to the hardpoints. It'll look like we're wearing mattresses, but it'll buy time." "How much time?" "Depends on the rad count. If it's what I think based on the signal degradation pattern, maybe 20 minutes of working time in the power module before cumulative dose crosses from treatable to permanent." 20 minutes. To find an alien power system they'd never seen, understand its architecture, and perform an isolation procedure in a language of light they couldn't speak, in a room that was trying to kill them. Yale considered the alternative: evacuate all 412 Cetheron onto the Blackmoor. "Can we fit them?" Rosado did the math. Cetheron are tall 2.5 meters but slender. "If we strip the cargo bays, convert the recreation deck, use every non-essential corridor, we can fit maybe 300, maybe 350 packed close. That leaves 60 to 100 with nowhere to go." "Yes. So we have to fix the station. Or fix enough of it to stabilize the habitat sphere while we work something else out." Rosado rubbed his jaw. Voss's report mentions secondary environmental pods, smaller spheres attached to the habitat by flexible docking tubes. Emergency shelters. If any are intact and the seals hold, we can isolate survivors in them while we work on the power module. Three-part operation. 3 teams. Yale began sketching it on the surface display, and as she drew, the thing stopped looking like a rescue and started looking like a heist. Team 1, Entry and Diplomacy. Board the station through the spar closest to the habitat sphere. Establish a beachhead. Make contact. Convince 412 frightened, light-speaking beings that the strange, suited creatures cutting through their airlock were friends, with a panel that could say 11 things. Team 2, Engineering. Move through the spars to the failed power module. Rig portable shielding. Get inside and either isolate the cascade or amputate the failing module from the station body by cutting the connecting spar and sealing the breach. 20-minute window in the hot zone. Team 3, Extraction. Locate and activate the emergency pods. Test their seals, atmosphere, thermal integrity. Move the most vulnerable Cetheron injured, young, radiation-sick into the pods first. If the power module fix failed, the pods became lifeboats. 3 teams, 12 people total, entering a dying alien station they'd never seen, built by a species that communicated in frequencies they couldn't replicate, while a radiation cascade ate the structure from the inside out. "This is insane," Rosado said mildly. "Yes," Yale agreed. "Who do you want on your team?" Tehrani spoke for the first time in 20 minutes. "Commander, the Cetheron are photosynthetic organisms. Their cellular repair mechanisms are light-driven. Our anti-radiation treatments were designed for hemoglobin-carrying biology. I have no idea if they'll work on the Cetheron. I need to rig phototherapy lamps that can deliver specific wavelengths to support their recovery. I can cannibalize the UV panels from the botany lab." "Do it." "I'll also set up triage stations in both shuttles. Wounded Cetheron get treatment at the extraction point, not back on the Blackmoor." "Approved." Tehrani stood. "And I'll prepare full anti-radiation protocols for the engineering team, because they're going to need them." She said it without inflection, a certainty. They drilled for 15 hours, not with equipment they had, with equipment they built. Rosado's section, fabricated radiation blankets from cargo container shielding, cutting and stitching lead composite panels into body wraps clipped onto EVA suit hardpoints. The result looked absurd, hulking, unbalanced, like a hazmat suit designed by someone who'd only read about hazmat suits in a poorly translated manual. But the dosimetry tests showed a 60% reduction in particle penetration, and 60% was the difference between 20 minutes and 8. Drysdale built a light communication device from a diagnostic display and 3 modified LED arrays, 11 phrases. "We are here to help. Follow us. Danger this direction. Stay calm. Medical assistance." 6 more variations that covered the essential vocabulary of a rescue conducted without a shared language. 11 phrases against 412 frightened aliens who'd been dying alone in the dark. Pavic ran breach drills in the cargo bay. His team Krall, DuPont, Velez, and Bao practiced the entry sequence 9 times. Cut a seal, establish atmosphere containment, deploy portable medical station, lay guidelines. Best time, 7 minutes and 12 seconds. Worst, 11. By the 6th drill, they stopped timing and started refining. Bao figured out that the atmospheric analyzer gave faster reads if angled 45 degrees into the airflow. DuPont discovered the guidelines stuck better to crystalline surfaces if dampened first. At hour 28, Yale briefed all 12 team members in the auxiliary planning room. She walked through the plan, the timelines, the abort criteria, and everything she didn't know. "We don't know the internal layout. We don't know the rad levels until we're there. We don't know if the Cetheron will trust us. We don't know if the pods work. We don't know if our medicine works on their biology." She looked at them. "What we do know is that 412 people are dying, and we're the only ones who showed up." Castillo, 26, best plasma cutter on the crew, the one Rosado trusted to make cuts within a millimeter of specification on materials she'd never trained on, raised her hand. "Commander, I ran the RAD numbers independently. The 20-minute window is the safe window. The functional window is 30 to 35 minutes before recovery becomes uncertain." "You stick to 20. "Yes, ma'am, but I wanted it on the record." "Noted, 20 minutes. At hour 32, Drysdale caught a change in the signal. Multiple sources now, call and response patterns, at least 4 distinct origin points inside the station. They're organizing something. The Cetheron weren't just waiting to die. They were preparing for whatever came next, rescue or end. At hour 36, the Blackmoor dropped out of sustained drive and the station appeared on sensors. It was worse than the models. The central habitat sphere was still intact barely. Its translucent surface, which should have been alive with shifting light, was dim. Patches of darkness spread across it like bruises on pale skin. One support spar, the one connecting to the failed power module, glowed with harsh, actinic white, radiation leakage visible to the naked eye. 2 other spars had gone fully dark. The remaining functional spar pulsed faintly, the station's last surviving support system, alone and overburdened. "Radiation readings," Yale said. "Off the charts around the failed module. The spar connecting it to the sphere is channeling high-energy particles directly into the habitat. Ambient radiation inside the sphere is already past dangerous for the Cetheron. They're approximately 3 times more sensitive to ionizing radiation than human baseline. And rising. At current rate, the sphere becomes lethal for Cetheron biology in approximately 12 hours. 12 hours, not the 46 they'd estimated from the initial signal. The cascade was accelerating. Thermal status. Core temperature dropped 14 degrees from Cetheron baseline. 2 thermal regulation modules fully offline. The Cetheron are photosynthetic. They need warmth and light to sustain metabolic function. Without ambient heat, their biology starts shutting down before the radiation kills them. 2 clocks, radiation in 12 hours, cold in 16, both converging on the same outcome from different directions. All teams launch in 90 minutes. The 90 minutes before launch were the quietest the Blackmoor had been in 2 days. Yale walked through the ship, stopping in each section, not inspecting, just present. In engineering, Rosado's team was doing final suit checks. Castillo had taped her dosimeter to the outside of her chest plate, where she could read it through the visor without looking down. Mbiwe was testing the welding rig one last time. Johansen was loading 3 different sealant compounds into separate applicators, labeled by color, because they didn't know which compound would bond to Cetheron crystalline material, and there wouldn't be time to test. In the shuttle bay, Pavik's team loaded the last supplies. Velez and Bao checked the guide lines, 200 meters of luminescent cord that would mark the path from the habitat sphere to the emergency pods. Kroll calibrated the atmospheric analyzer. DuPont ran through the light panel's phrase library with his eyes closed, mouthing the color sequences like a man memorizing a prayer in a language he didn't speak. She found Tehrani in the medical bay, laying out treatment trays with the methodical precision of someone who had done this enough times to trust the routine. 2 UV spectrum phototherapy lamps from the botany lab sat on the counter, rewired and recalibrated for therapeutic wavelengths. 3 anti-radiation treatment kits, preloaded. How many casualties can you handle? 6 critical, 12 moderate. After that, we're triaging in corridors and hoping the corridor air filtration holds. She looked up. But the real question is the Cetheron. If our treatments don't work on their biology, we improvise. The phototherapy lamps are my best guess. UV spectrum light to kickstart their photosynthetic repair pathways. Nobody's ever tested it. It's more than they have now. It's always more than they have now. That's the job. The Blackmoor's 2 shuttles deployed simultaneously. Shuttle 1 carried teams 1 and 3 8 people under Pavik, splitting at the habitat sphere. Shuttle 2 carried Team 2 Rosado and 3 engineers, heading for the contaminated spar. Yale stayed on the bridge. She wanted to go. Every instinct, every reflex built in 22 years of service said go. But the ship needed a commander who could see the whole board, who could reroute resources, who could make the calls that looked cold from the outside but kept people alive on the inside. She watched the shuttles cross the gap, 2 small, bright points moving toward something vast and wounded and dark. Shuttle 1 docking at Habitat Spar. Seal is holding. Atmosphere thin but breathable. Readings confirm Cetheron compatible. We're going in. Shuttle 2 on approach to the contaminated spar. Radiation is significant. Blankets deployed. Yale keyed her comm. Rosado, rad levels. Manageable in the spar. The module itself is going to be the furnace. We'll know the real numbers when we open the hatch. A pause. 20 minutes inside. If we can't isolate the cascade, we cut the spar and seal it. Either way, we stop the bleed. Be careful. Commander, I'm wearing a lead-lined mattress over a suit that smells like recycled air and regret. Careful left the building 2 days ago. Inside the habitat sphere, Pavik's team cut through the outer airlock membrane and entered something none of them had expected. Light. Despite the failing systems, despite the radiation creeping through the walls, despite the cold and the thin air and the slow structural dying of everything around them, the interior of the sphere was illuminated. Not by the station systems, most of those were dark. By the Cetheron themselves. Hundreds of them, gathered in the central volume of the sphere, their translucent bodies pulsing with slow, rhythmic light. Blues and greens, mostly frequencies Drysdale had mapped to grief and endurance in the Cetheron emotional spectrum. They were mourning, and they were holding. The Cetheron had arranged themselves in concentric rings, 5 rings deep, each glowing at a different intensity. The outermost ring, the largest adults, closest to the contaminated wall, were the dimmest. Their once translucent bodies carried a faint clouding where radiation had begun to damage the bioluminescent cells. Dark traceries ran along their limbs like old scars forming in real time, the visible markers of ionizing particles being absorbed into living tissue. They were shielding the inner rings with their bodies. The second ring was brighter, the third brighter still, a gradient of sacrifice, perfectly organized, perfectly maintained. Pavik's radiation sensor confirmed it. The dose rate dropped sharply with each ring inward. The outer adults were absorbing the worst of the cascade, their own tissue paying the price, so the ones behind them could endure a little longer. And in the center, glowing with the faintest rose and amber, were the young. They'd organized themselves by sacrifice. That was what the call-and-response patterns had been, not a plan to escape, not a signal to any rescuer, but a plan to endure. A system of rotational self-sacrifice, the outer ring absorbing lethal doses so the inner rings would last 1 more hour. And then 1 more, and 1 more after that, with nothing but their own bodies and their own diminishing light between their children and the radiation eating through the walls. Pavik stopped walking, his team stopped behind him. Then one of the outer ring Cetheron turned. It was tall, close to 3 meters, its body, a column of pale, luminous tissue marked with the dark veining of absorbed radiation. Its face was a smooth expanse with deep-set reflective eyes that caught Pavik's helmet light and held it. Its skin pulsed once. A single deep blue wave that rolled from its chest to its fingertips and faded. Pavik raised the light communication panel. He pressed the first phrase. The panel pulsed, amber-white amber, we are here to help. The Cetheron stared. Then it turned to the others. A ripple of color moved through the rings fast, complex, layered with frequencies the panel couldn't reproduce. Communication beyond the 11 phrases. A conversation happening in a language of light that the humans could witness but never fully understand. One of the inner adults, smaller, perhaps a leader or elder, moved forward through the circles until it stood face to face with Pavic. It pulsed, a complex pattern that the post-mission analysis team later decoded as a question: who sent you? The panel didn't have "nobody sent us." It didn't have "we heard you and we came." It didn't have "every system that was supposed to listen filed your scream under local matter, and we were a survey ship running a cartographic update, and we came anyway." It had 11 phrases, and none of them were right. So Pavic took off his glove, slowly. He held up his bare hand, palm forward, fingers spread, and he stood there in the blue-green light of 412 beings who had been screaming into a void that didn't care, and he let them see he was real, warm-blooded, small, unafraid. The Setheron leader pulsed again, softer this time, a pale gold that started at its chest and spread outward in a slow wave until every Setheron in the sphere was echoing it, ring by ring, like a wave rolling inward to the center where the young glowed brighter in response. Drysdale, monitoring the feed from the shuttle, whispered across the comm, "That frequency's not in the database, but the way it propagates inward to the young, I think it means yes." "Yes, come in, we accept." Team 3 split off toward the emergency pods. Pavic's remaining team started through the rings. Gently, the light panel pulsing "follow us" and "safety this direction," as they guided the innermost ring, the young and the most fragile, toward the pod access points. The first complication hit within 10 minutes. Pod 1's docking tube was partially collapsed. Thermal contraction from the failing heating systems had warped the flexible material to less than a meter in diameter. Kroll and DuPont spent 12 minutes reinforcing it with emergency bracing from the shuttle's structural kit, working in a passage barely wide enough for one human at a time. Velez held the far end open with his shoulders braced against the walls, boots dug into the deck. One outer ring adult moved closer without being asked, placed its translucent hands alongside DuPont's on the bracing, and pressed outward. The combined force, human leverage and Setheron light-guided musculature, widened the passage enough for adults to crouch through. 92 Setheron entered Pod 1. Mostly young, a handful of injured adults, one elder whose light had gone almost completely dark. Bow confirmed SEAL's atmosphere and thermal readings, within tolerance, barely. Pod 2 was intact, tube clear, SEALs holding, atmosphere thin but stable. Loading began immediately. 112 Setheron, guided by the light panel and by an increasingly intuitive system of gestures that had evolved between Pavic's team and the Setheron adults. Point, nod, pulse, step. A language built in minutes from necessity. Meanwhile, in the contaminated spar, Rosato's team advanced. The suit sensors screamed every 30 seconds, a tone Rosato muted after the first 2 minutes because it drowned out voice communication and told him nothing he didn't already know. The lead composite blankets reduced exposure by 60%, which meant they still absorbed 40% of a dose that would be lethal in 8 minutes unshielded. The spar was a corridor of translucent crystal, its walls pulsing with sickly light that flickered between amber and white, the bioluminescent equivalent of emergency lighting running on failing power. The floor was warm under their boots, not comfort warm, radiation warm. Every surface glowed faintly with trapped energy the Setheron construction was never designed to contain. Halfway through the spar, Mbue pointed to cracks in the wall, hairline fractures branching from stress points, with thin streamers of bioluminescent plasma leaking through like slow-bleeding wounds in glass. "The spar is degrading," Rosato said. "If this propagates further, we lose containment entirely. The whole corridor becomes hot." The hatch to the power module was organic Setheron design, a membrane of hardened translucent material with a light-encoded lock that neither opened nor responded to anything Risato's team could produce. Johansen cut through the frame with a plasma torch, the membrane peeling back like skin from a wound, and the radiation behind it hit them in a wall. Risato's dosimeter jumped. The numbers were worse than modeled, 15 minutes, maybe less. The power module was a cathedral, or had been. Cetheron power generation used focused bioluminescent plasma contained in crystalline conduits grown, not manufactured, organic lattice structures interwoven with energy-conductive veins that channeled light into power. 7 of 12 primary conduits had shattered. Plasma leaked from the fractures in streams of actinic white, blinding even through visor filters, each failure feeding energy into the next in a chain reaction that was still propagating through the remaining lattice. "We can't fix this," Mbue said. "We're not fixing it. We're amputating." Risato pointed to the main conduit trunk 1/2 meter in diameter, crystalline, pulsing with contained plasma entering the spar back toward the habitat sphere. "Sever the trunk. Seal the spar side end with the fabricated cap. The cascade stays here. The sphere keeps whatever power the remaining functional module can deliver." "How long for the cut?" Castillo examined the crystalline matrix, assessing density, grain, plasma pressure. Her hands were steady. 8 minutes for a clean cut, maybe 10. The plasma inside is pressurized. It'll spray when I breach the outer layer. I'm on sealant, Mbue on backup. Johansen watches dosimeters and calls time. Anyone hits threshold, you pull them, no discussion, no heroics. No heroics. Castillo started cutting. The plasma torch bit into crystal and the module lit up like a sun. Bioluminescent plasma sprayed in white-hot particles that burned pinhole-sized holes in Castillo's radiation blanket and left scorch marks across her visor. She adjusted her angle, compensated for the spray pattern, and kept cutting. Steady hands. Controlled breath. The dosimeter ticking upward with every second. On the bridge, Yale listened to 3 feeds simultaneously. Pavic guiding Cetheron into pods. Risato cutting crystal in a radiation furnace. And the station itself groaning with a deep structural pulse like the breathing of something vast and wounded, counting down to a failure nobody could prevent. Pavic status. Pod 1 loaded. 92. Pod 2 located, tube intact, loading now at 100 and counting. Pod 3's outer seal is compromised, hairline fracture in the docking ring. Velez is attempting repair with compound 3. He has 15 minutes before I reassess. Understood. The second pod is filling fast. The Cetheron are cooperating fully. But Commander, the entire outer ring is still in the sphere. Approximately 98 adults. They haven't moved toward any pod. Risato. Castillo 60% through the conduit trunk. 4 more minutes at current rate. His voice was strained, not with effort, with awareness of what the dosimeter was doing. You have 4, not 5. Copy. Inside the sphere, Pavic hit the hardest part. The outer ring adults, approximately 98 individuals who had absorbed escalating radiation for hours, whose translucent bodies were now laced with dark traceries of cellular damage, refused to move toward the pods. They weren't panicking, they weren't confused, they were choosing. They stepped aside, made room, pulsed a steady deep blue endurance persistence, the frequency the database mapped to I hold, and gestured the inner rings past them toward the pod access points. The tall one who'd first faced Pavic, the 3-meter adult with radiation scars spreading through its luminous tissue, placed a hand on Pavic's shoulder. The grip was light. The skin was warm, too warm, and Pavic realized it was radiation burn, the creature's damaged tissue generating heat as irradiated cells broke down. It was cooking from the inside, and it was channeling that heat outward, away from the ones behind it, turning even its own destruction into one more act of protection. It pulsed amber gold, the color Drystill couldn't translate, the color that propagated inward to the young. Then it turned back to face the contaminated wall. They were all staying. The outer ring had decided their role was to shield, and they would shield until the last child was safe and the last adult was through, and nothing remained of them but the light they'd given. Pavic pressed the panel. "Follow us, safety this direction." The tall Sethuran looked at the panel. Looked at Pavic. Pulsed blue-green, a frequency later decoded as something between, "I understand what you're saying, and that is not what I'm doing." Then it dimmed its own luminescence just enough to redirect its remaining light inward, toward the children being guided to the pods, as if giving them one last measure of warmth from across the widening distance. "Commander," Pavic's voice was rough, "the outer ring adults are holding position. They're shielding the retreat. They know what it's costing them." "How many?" 98. Yale closed her eyes. 98 adults choosing to burn so their children could reach safety, not because anyone asked them to, because that was what the outer ring was for. "Continue evacuation. Do not force anyone. Respect their decision." "Understood." Pavic's voice cracked on the second syllable. In the power module, Castillo finished the cut. The conduit trunk separated with a sound like breaking glass amplified through crystal, a resonant crack that rang through the module and set the remaining lattice vibrating. Bioluminescent fluid flooded from the severed end in a torrent of white-hot plasma. Rosado lunged with the fabricated cap, hull plating bent into a cylinder, coated with 3 sealant compounds because they still didn't know which would bond, and slammed it over the open end. Mbue braced from behind. Johansen passed the welding rig. The welds were uneven, ugly. Made by hands in radiation blankets through visors smeared with plasma residue, in a room that was actively trying to kill them. The first sealant compound didn't bond to the crystal. The second held weakly. The third, the polymer, caught and held, curring on contact with the crystalline surface in a reaction nobody had predicted, but everyone accepted. The cap held. The plasma stopped. The cascade, cut off from its path to the habitat sphere, began to eat itself inside the module contained, still lethal in this room, but no longer reaching the people it had been killing. Seal is holding, radiation levels in the spar declining, cascade contained. "Get out, all 4 of you, now." "That's in order." Rosado's dosimeter beeped the threshold alarm, hardwired, unmutable, the sound every engineer learned to dread. He didn't read the number. Castillo's beeped 3 seconds later. They'd crossed the safe exposure line somewhere around minute 16. They'd been inside for 22. 2 minutes. 2 minutes past the window Yale had set, past the line Castillo had acknowledged, past the point where the math shifted from treatable to "we'll see." 2 minutes because Castillo was 3 cuts from finishing, and Rosado made the call to stay, and neither of them discussed it because there was nothing to discuss. The Sethuran in the outer ring had been absorbing lethal radiation for hours. The humans could give 2 more minutes. They moved through the spar. Through the shuttle hatch. Johansen sealed the door. 4 people breathing hard inside lead-lined blankets in a shuttle that smelled like ozone and burnt crystal, and the particular metallic tang of irradiated air. "Dosimetry report," Yale said. A pause, the kind of pause that carries its own diagnosis. Mbue and Johansen within acceptable limits, full recovery expected with standard protocol. Another pause. Castillo and I exceeded safe threshold, full anti-radiation protocol, sooner rather than later. Cellular damage. The kind that required marrow therapy, reconstruction, months in a specialized facility. The kind that sometimes reversed completely and sometimes didn't. Medical is standing by. Get back to the Blackmoor. With the cascade contained, the sphere stabilized. Radiation readings dropped. Temperature decline slowed. Pavic continued the evacuation with renewed urgency. Pod 2 filled. 112 Cetheron, including a cluster of adolescents whose bioluminescence was rapidly returning to full strength now that the radiation source was cut off. Their light shifted from the muted blues of endurance to warmer tones gold, amber, soft green, and the adults around them responded, brightening in turn, a cascade of their own, the healing kind. Velez got Pod 3's seal repaired in 13 minutes with Compound 3, emergency bracing, and what he later described in his mission report as aggressive optimism, and approximately 4 words I won't repeat. Pod 3 received another 110 Cetheron, including the most radiation-damaged outer ring members, carried through the docking tubes by human hands when their own legs failed. 2 outer ring adults were so weak that their bioluminescence flickered erratically, a sign of severe neurological distress. Pavik's team carried them with extraordinary care, translucent limbs draped over human shoulders, dark-veined skin warm against suit fabric. In total, 314 Cetheron were evacuated to the 3 pods. 52 of the original 98 outer ring adults remained in the sphere. They would not leave. The Cetheron leader stayed with them, moving among them, touching each one, pressing its translucent hands against their damaged skin, its light steady amber gold. Later analysis of the spectral recordings identified the frequency as something between "I am proud of you" and "I am still here." The distinction, the xenolinguistic team noted, might not exist in Cetheron thought. Over the next 11 hours, the crew of the Blackmoor worked in rotating shifts to stabilize what remained. The first priority was thermal. With 2 modules dark and 1 amputated, heating capacity ran at 30% of baseline. Okonkwo's navigation team, reassigned entirely to damage control, spent 6 hours splicing human power couplings into the Cetheron thermal distribution grid. The couplings didn't fit. The voltage standards differed by an order of magnitude. The connection points were crystalline nodes designed for light frequency activation, and human couplings were metal contacts carrying electrical current. They made it work using the light panel to coordinate with 3 Cetheron station engineers who emerged from the inner rings, beings who had built and maintained this technology, who understood it the way humans understood circuit boards, and who couldn't explain it in any frequency the panel could render. But they could point at broken things and hand each other tools and nod when readings moved in the right direction, and that was language enough. By hour 40, the temperature in the sphere had stabilized. By 42, it was rising. The second priority was atmosphere. Pavik's team rigged a pump from Shuttle 2's life support system, running flexible ducting through a sealed port into the sphere. The pump was designed for 8 occupants. It was now supplementing 412. But the Cetheron's respiratory needs were significantly lower than human baseline. Their photosynthetic metabolism processed atmosphere differently, requiring less oxygen turnover, and the supplemental output slowed atmospheric degradation from critical to manageable. The third priority was the outer ring. Tehrani set up her phototherapy lamps in a ring around the 52 remaining adults. She calibrated the UV wavelengths to the academic literature's best guess, a guess based on a 20-year-old merchant report. A xenobiology paper cited 14 times and all by its own author, and Tehrani's instinct about how photosynthetic cellular repair ought to work if the universe had any consistency. It worked. Within 3 hours, the Cetheron under the lamps began to glow brighter. Their bioluminescent cells, starved of usable light energy by the radiation damage, responded to the targeted UV input like a dehydrated body to clean water. The flickering stopped. The dark traceries began to fade at their edges. 2 collapsed Cetheron opened their reflective eyes and pulsed faintly but coherently, for the first time in hours. Tehrani allowed herself 1 sentence, "The theory holds." Then she did something outside any protocol, any procedure, any guideline in the fleet medical manual. She sat down next to the most damaged Cetheron, the tall one from the outer ring, the 3-meter adult whose translucent body was clouded with radiation damage from hours of deliberate exposure, and she adjusted the lamp until the light fell directly on its chest. And she sat there, 40 minutes, monitoring with a handheld scanner calibrated for the wrong species, reading values she was interpreting in real time against a theoretical model she'd built that morning. After 20 minutes, its light brightened half a degree. After 30, it pulsed once a color Tehrani scanner recorded as unclassified visible spectrum, 582 nm dominant, steady, and aimed directly at her. She couldn't read the frequency. She understood it anyway. They treated Rosado and Castillo as soon as Shuttle 2 returned to the Blackmoor. The anti-radiation protocol went in fast intravenous chelation agents, marrow-protective compounds, cellular repair stimulants. Rosado took it without complaint, lying gray-skinned on a medical bed with IV lines in both arms and a monitor beeping at a rate that was slower than it should have been. Castillo made a joke about glowing in the dark. Nobody laughed. She went quiet and stared at the ceiling, cataloging what she could and couldn't feel in her hands, the way a musician might test each finger after an injury, assessing the damage by what no longer responded. Yale visited at hour 44. Tehrani met her outside the medical bay. Her face said what the words were about to confirm. Rosado's marrow is responding to treatment. He'll recover. 3 to 4 months of intensive therapy at a proper facility, but the prognosis is good. She paused. In the pause lived everything else. Castillo was closest to the conduit during the final cuts. Her hands were on the torch when the plasma sprayed through the blanket, higher extremity exposure by a significant margin. Tehrani met Yale's eyes. She'll live, full lifespan. But the nerve damage in her hands and forearms is likely permanent. Fine motor control is compromised. The tremor won't resolve. She knew. They both did. Rosado calculated the probable dose before entry. He knew they'd exceed threshold if the cut took more than 18 minutes. He chose not to pull his team at minute 20 because Castillo was 3 cuts from finishing. 3 cuts, 2 more minutes. 2 more minutes, he made the call. Yale stood in the corridor outside the medical bay and breathed. Nothing in the regulations covered this. Nothing said it was right. Nothing said it was wrong. Only the fact of it, and the fact that 52 Cetheron, who had been prepared to die in the outer ring, were going to live because 2 humans stayed in a room that was killing them for 2 minutes longer than the math allowed. At hour 47, the GCV Carenthal arrived at the boundary. Yale's burst to Sector Command had worked its way through the bureaucracy, flagged, routed, reflagged, escalated, questioned, re-escalated, and finally landed on the desk of someone with enough rank and enough conscience to act. The Council dispatched a Meridian-class emergency response cruiser, 400 meters of purpose-built rescue capacity, bristling with modular medical pods, atmospheric processors, evacuation bays calibrated to 60 species biological requirements, 3 full medical teams, a xenobiology unit, structural engineering specialists, and supplies sufficient for 1,000 displaced beings over 6 months. It had taken them 47 hours. The Blackmoor had taken 41. Captain Varos Kell hailed the Blackmoor on approach. Professional. Clipped. The tone of an officer dispatched urgently who'd arrived to find the job already done by people with no business doing it. ISV Blackmoor, this is GCV Carenthal. Responding to Priority 1 distress relay forwarded by 8th Corridor Sector Command. Advise on station status and current situation. Carenthal, this is Commander Marin. Station stabilized. Cascade radiation event contained via conduit amputation at the primary spar junction. 412 Cetheron accounted for 314 evacuated to emergency pods, 52 under active phototherapy support in the habitat sphere, 46 receiving supplemental atmospheric and thermal support. 2 members of my crew in critical care for radiation overexposure, sustained during the containment operation. Silence not static, recalculation. Blackmoor, you crossed the Keth boundary to effect this rescue. Affirmative. Without Council authorization. The Council's monitoring infrastructure archived the distress signal as a non-priority indigenous event. No authorization was issued or requested. The signal was dying. We went. Another silence. Longer. When Varos Kell spoke again, the professionalism had softened by exactly 1 degree. Understood, Blackmoor. We are proceeding to assume long-term stabilization and care responsibilities. Hold position. The Caranthal docked 2 hours later. 56 medical specialists, xenobiologists, radiation therapists, atmospheric engineers, structural assessors moved through the sphere in pods with the practiced efficiency of a system designed for exactly this. Full-spectrum radiation therapy calibrated to Cetheron photosynthetic biology. Atmospheric restoration tuned to their specific metabolic requirements. Nutrient light panels delivering wavelengths matched to their cellular repair pathways. Everything the right ship would bring. 6 hours after the wrong ship had finished. Varos Kell sent a private channel request to the Blackmoor at hour 49. Yale accepted it in her ready room. Commander Marin. His voice was different on the private channel, quieter, stripped of the formality that rank requires when others are listening. My senior medical officer has reviewed your team's phototherapy treatment protocol. The cellular repair response it triggered in the radiation-damaged Cetheron, she says it's a technique we didn't have in our database. She's logged it as a field-originated innovation and submitted it for fleet-wide medical integration. He paused. She's also reviewed the conduit amputation. The fabricated cap your engineer built from hull plating and polymer sealant will hold for years. The Cetheron station engineers have already indicated they intend to build the replacement module around it. That's Chief Engineer Rosato's work, and Specialist Castillo's. I've read their dosimetry reports. Another pause, weighted differently. Commander, my crew would not have arrived in time. At the cascade acceleration rate your people documented, the sphere would have become lethal for the Cetheron approximately 6 hours before my earliest possible arrival. 6 hours. He let the number sit. The Council archived the signal. My ship was dispatched only after your burst reached someone with enough rank to override the archive classification. That process took 9 hours. I didn't do it for the math, Captain. No. That's the part the review board won't know how to write up. A beat. Caranthal out. As the Caranthal's teams assumed full control of the station and the evacuation pods, the Cetheron leader requested permission to board the Blackmoor. Yale granted it. The Cetheron came aboard alone. Shorter than many of the others, 2 meters, slender even by Cetheron standards, its translucent body dimmer than it should have been, bioluminescence muted by exhaustion and residual radiation damage. Dark lines ran beneath its skin where the luminescent cells hadn't fully recovered, visible beneath the surface like veins in frosted glass. Pavic escorted it from the docking port to the bridge. It stood in the center of the human bridge and looked around. At the scuffed consoles with their scratched displays. At the crew in their worn duty uniforms, stained and rumpled from 2 days without proper rest. At the small, functional, unlovely space that had carried 41 people 72 light hours past the line where anyone was supposed to care, through 41 hours of transit toward a signal that every system in the galaxy had decided was someone else's problem. It turned to Yale. Its skin pulsed, a long, slow wave that moved from deep blue to amber gold to a shade of violet that no human instrument had ever recorded, a frequency that existed in no database, mapped to no known Cetheron emotional category, documented in no academic paper or merchant report. It held the violet for 20 seconds while the bridge crew stood motionless, and Drysdale's spectral analyzer recorded every wavelength in silence. Then it reached out and placed its hand translucent, warm, impossibly gentle on the edge of Yale's console. And it dimmed, all the way until its body was almost dark, a silhouette of living crystal against the bridge lighting. And then it relit slowly from the point of contact outward, as if drawing light from the console or giving it, as if the boundary between giving and receiving was another distinction that didn't exist in Cetheron thought. Drysdale's spectrum analysis of the full sequence, completed weeks later, identified three concepts in continuous wave: deep blue for "we were alone," amber gold for "and then you came," and the violet, the frequency no database contained, for something the xenolinguistic team at the Callaway Institute spent 4 months attempting to translate. The closest they reached, with appropriate caveats about the limitations of cross-species emotional mapping. The ones who arrived when arriving was the entire cost. Yale stood. She placed her hand on the console next to the Cetherons. No light panel, no translation device, no words in any language, right or wrong. She stood there, and that was enough. It was always going to be enough. The Cetheron pulsed once more, warm, steady. A pale gold that filled the bridge like dawn coming through a window in a room where someone has been waiting all night. Then it withdrew its hand, and Pavic escorted it home. In the end, all 412 Cetherons survived. The outer ring adults, the 52 who had held their positions until the cascade was contained, whose translucent bodies had absorbed doses that would have killed most carbon-based species, required the most extensive treatment. The Carenthal's medical teams, using Tehrani's field-originated phototherapy protocol as a foundation, developed a comprehensive recovery program combining targeted UV exposure with Cetheron-compatible cellular repair compounds, synthesized from the station's own bioluminescent materials. One by one, over weeks, the dark traceries faded from their limbs and their light returned different, the xenobiologists noted, subtly shifted in spectrum from what it had been before, as if the damage had changed the frequency of their luminescence permanently without diminishing it. They glowed with the scars. The children recovered fully. The youngest 12, the ones who'd been in the innermost ring, shielded by every adult between them and the contaminated wall, showed no measurable radiation effects at all. The ring had held. Every sacrifice, every adult who'd stepped into the outer position and absorbed what was coming, every hour of organized endurance it had held. The station's failed power module was replaced 4 months later by a council engineering team working in coordination with the Cetheron station engineers. They built the new module around Rosato's fabricated cap, which was still holding, still sealed, the polymer sealant bonded to the crystalline conduit as if it had grown there. The Cetheron engineers who oversaw the rebuild requested specifically that the cap not be removed. It stayed. A piece of human hull plating, cut from a survey vessel's cargo container lining, welded to alien crystal with uneven seams by hands in radiation blankets, embedded permanently in a Cetheron station 72 light towers past the Keth boundary. A scar that looked like a choice. Rosato recovered after 4 months of intensive marrow therapy at the Callaway Station Medical Center. He returned to the Blackmoor's engineering section and never discussed the 22 minutes in detail. When asked about it by colleagues, by journalists, by the review board, he said the same thing each time. We went in, we cut the thing, we got out. The Cetheron did the hard part. They stood in that ring for hours with nothing but their own bodies. We stood in a room for 20 minutes. 22 minutes, he always said 20. Castillo did not fully recover. The nerve damage in her hands was permanent, a fine, constant tremor that made precision tool work impossible. The thing she'd been the best at in the world. The thing Rosato had trusted her to do because nobody else could do it as well. She transferred out of active engineering duty 6 weeks after the mission and into the Engineering Corps Training Division at Callaway Station. She She taught the next generation of ship engineers how to fabricate radiation shielding from cargo container plating in under 3 hours, how to cut an alien power conduit without hesitation, and how to calculate the real cost of staying 2 minutes past the safe exposure line. When students asked why they needed to know this, why they needed to learn field fabrication and improvised shielding, when the fleet had specialized rescue vessels designed for exactly these situations, she held up her hands, steady enough to hold a stylus, too unsteady to hold a plasma torch. "Because someday you'll hear something nobody else is listening to," she said, "and you'll have to decide what you're made of." She never said it with bitterness. Her students noticed. The Galactic Council conducted a formal review of the Blackmoor's actions. 3 days of hearings. Signal logs, transit authorization records, boundary crossing protocols, boarding plan, conduit amputation procedure, evacuation sequence, casualty reports, Carenthal arrival timeline, operational handoff documentation. They interviewed Yale, Pavic, Rosado, and Tehrani. They requested complete dosimetry records for all 12 team members. They reviewed the hegemony buoy's archive log and the 9-hour delay between Yale's burst and the Carenthal's dispatch. The finding was 2 sentences. No disciplinary action recommended. Operational conduct consistent with the highest standards of interspecies duty. 2 sentences for 41 hours of transit, 22 minutes in a radiation furnace, 98 adults in a ring of sacrifice, and a signal that nobody was supposed to answer. The Cetheron did not join the Galactic Council. They declined again, politely, through the same light-encoded diplomatic channels they'd used 9 years earlier. But they did something they had never done in the recorded history of their interactions with other species. They opened a single, permanent, light-encoded communication channel, broadcast continuously from their rebuilt station into the deep space relay network. It wasn't aimed at the Council, not at the Meridian Assembly or the Hegemony or any institution that had archived their scream under non-priority indigenous event, not at the monitoring buoys that had forwarded a dying signal to a relay hub that filed it and moved on. It was aimed at Earth's relay network, a beam of amber gold light, steady and constant, reaching across 72 light hours of empty space to the one species that had heard them and come, not because it was required, not because it was authorized, not because anyone with rank or jurisdiction or mandate had ordered it done, because a survey vessel running a cartographic update had caught a dying signal and turned into the dark. Yale Marin filed her after-action report 14 days after the Blackmoor returned to the 8th corridor. 72 pages, thorough, precise, and dry in the way military documents are dry when the writer has seen things that would break the prose if she let them. The last line read, "Recommendation: the Keth Boundary Listening Post Network should be restored to full operational coverage. The Archive and Ignore Protocol for Indigenous Distress Events in Unmonitored Sovereign Space should be discontinued. Every signal deserves an answer." The Council noted the recommendation. It was added to a policy reform queue with a projected review timeline of 18 months. As of the last available record, it remains under review. But the amber gold light from the Cetheron station still reaches the Earth relay network every day. Steady, unbroken, a frequency that means something no database can contain and no committee can archive. And in the Navigation Corps, among the survey crews and deplane operators who run the long routes past the charted edges where the relay signals thin and the dark gets honest, they have a name for it. Not its frequency designation, not its sector code, not the catalog number the Council assigned it when they finally acknowledged its existence. They call it the Marin frequency. Not because of what it says, because of what it answered.